All right, so we're now into week 5, and this week we take up the issue of poverty. And so this lecture will be broken up into 3 different parts. In the first part of this lecture, we'll start with some working definitions of poverty, 3 in particular, that we'll use throughout the course. And then we'll follow that up with discussion of 4 major explanations, 4 most popular explanations for why people are poor. And that'll conclude the first part. In the second part of this lecture, we'll take up the issue of poverty measurement, and specifically about how the U.S. Census Bureau actually goes about measuring poverty to release their poverty estimates every year. And we'll take a closer look. We'll see who's poor in the U.S. We'll distinguish between poverty rates and poverty composition, what those terms mean. And to give us a better feel for what the poverty estimates actually mean, we'll take a look at poverty rates, how they changed across time, and how they differ across different national contexts. That'll conclude the second part of this lecture. And then in the last part of this lecture, we'll take up the policy response. So what do we do about poverty is the basic question in the third part. And so we have a new conundrum, and this conundrum has to do with this trade-off between poverty and dependency. The more effectively we address poverty, then we may be incentivizing dependency. The more effectively we reduce dependency on government, we may be giving rise to poverty or greater rates of poverty. And so we're left with another conundrum. And so I introduce you to a policy mechanism that's been used historically to address both poverty and dependency simultaneously, and that's the use of an earnings disregard. So that'll conclude this lecture. First, just in the way of definitions, so like we discussed last week in the way of diversity. So in a similar fashion, poverty is multidimensional. Just like when we said diversity, that discussion could have gone in a number of different ways beyond just talking about race and gender. We could have talked about multiple other dimensions, disability, sexual orientation, and such. Poverty, in a similar fashion, I would argue, is multidimensional, but we limit our discussion here to economic definitions, right, or economic notions of poverty. So we're not talking about relational poverty or social poverty. We're talking about economic deprivation. And having the economic resources to maintain a minimally adequate standard of living is how we're defining poverty for purposes of this class. And so we didn't actually start measuring or looking at poverty as a governmental matter, or as a policy matter until the 1960s. But certainly there are scholars who have thought about poverty for much longer, or much further into the past than the 1960s. And so I give you one alternative definition of poverty that's put forth by Adam Smith, who's often credited with being the founding father of our capitalist system. And so back in 1776, he defines poverty as whatever the custom of the country, and those are italics. Those italics are my emphasis. So whatever the custom of the country renders it indecent for even for creditable people to be without, right? So this notion of custom of the country and the fact that poverty may change as the custom of the country may change. So one of the examples that I often give in this section is if it's a custom of the country for creditable people to be with these phablets, right? So not a tablet or smartphone, but the new phablets that are sort of in between in the way of size. And so if everyone has a phablet and you don't have a phablet, then maybe you're considered poor according to that society's standards. I think that's my interpretation of Adam Smith's notion of poverty here. All right, so we have 3 working definitions of poverty. So we're taking an economic view of poverty, and we're providing you with 3 very specific working or operational definitions of poverty here. So we have absolute poverty and relative poverty and subjective poverty. First, in the way of absolute poverty is outsider-based. It's an outsider's perspective on poverty, and so when you have an expert, a presumed expert on poverty who says, this is the line, in terms of income, and anyone with income below this amount is considered to be poor. That's an absolute notion of poverty. And then we have a relative notion of poverty that's, I think, most consistent with Adam Smith's version of poverty. It's tied to what others have in our society. If others have that cell phone or that phablet, and you don't, you might be considered poor. The one working definition that we use is to take median income, right? We'll often take median household income, and if we take 50% of the median household income, that's a relative standard, right? It's relative to the median household in a particular local area. And if your household income is less than 25% of that median, then you're considered to be poor. That's a standard that's used by our local housing authorities in establishing eligibility for the housing voucher program, or Section 8. And then finally, we have subjective poverty. And subjective poverty, like our discussion of subjective versus objective notions of race, subjective poverty is simply in your mind, right? It's the product of your individual consciousness. There's as many notions of poverty as there are people in this world. Everyone has a different view of poverty, is the idea. If there's a survey that goes out and it's asking people what you think you need to get by, your response would be a subjective or an individual view of poverty. That's, of course, a subjective poverty. So we have an outsider-based, an insider-based. Relative poverty is insider-based, right? Relative to you're living in poverty and you're comparing yourself to someone else. And then we have subjective poverty in your own mind. So we're moving past definitions into explanations for poverty, or theories of poverty. And we have four major theories that we present. There are certainly more than four theories, but these are the four, I think, most popular explanations. There's also human capital theory that might explain poverty, but we're just looking at these four. And so there's at least two different dimensions by which we can classify these explanations. And so the first sort of classification that we use here is in the way of whether poverty is rooted in the individual or whether it's rooted in structural factors. That's one line that we use to distinguish these explanations. Another line, or another dimension in which we can classify these different explanations, is in the way of whether we think poverty is rooted in the individual or rooted in the societal structure in which we live, namely capitalism. Is it rooted in capitalism or rooted in the individual? Or is it a byproduct of some byproduct of the individual or byproduct of the capitalist system? That's another dimension by which we can classify these different explanations. So first, we're looking at a micro-level view of poverty, looking at poverty as inherent in individuals, namely that people are poor because of genetic inferiority. Right? This is, of course, not the explanation that I would promote, but certainly there are lots of people today who still believe in this sort of explanation. But this would be attributing poverty, namely to IQ differences. Right? People are poor because of differences in IQ, and some scholars may take it a step further and say that there might be some racial differences that are linked to IQ differences, which in turn help explain income or asset differences. Right? So you can see how this explanation works. This is the most pessimistic view of poverty, in my view, because if you think poverty is rooted in genetic factors, then certainly there's really not much we can do in the way of advocating for the poor, right? So I'd like to steer you away from this definition, or this explanation, I should say, if possible. We have a second line of explanations, and we're still at the individual level. This is saying that people are poor because of individual level factors, but not because of inherent characteristics like IQ or genetic differences, but because of the values and norms that the poor hold, right? That taken together, if you look at all the values and norms that characterize the poor in our society, it forms this sort of culture of poverty, in other words, right? So this is another name for this explanation is the culture of poverty thesis, that people are poor because they live in this culture that promotes the wrong values and norms. These are values and norms that aren't really conducive to getting ahead in our society, namely that the poor are poor because they're lazy, they're too present-minded, they don't know how to delay gratification, they have low self-esteem, right? These types of explanations or these types of values are what characterize the poor, is what the theory is suggesting. Of course, once again, there are more extreme versions, more moderate versions. The extreme version might say this culture of poverty is transmitted from one generation to the next. And so if your grandparents didn't value hard work, then maybe your parents don't value hard work, and down to the children. More modern versions would say, well, it's really just about role models. If we provided the right role models, then the poor could learn the right values and norms to succeed in our society. And so, once again, the emphasis is on values and norms and this culture of poverty that might be contributing to why people are poor. And so, a little more optimistic than IQ differences, or the first explanation certainly, that we can change people's culture and teach people the right values, provide the right role models, and people will, the poor will get ahead in our society. Might be the solution, right? And then we switch gears, we look at structural explanations, and this is this third line of explanations is arguably the most popular among social scientists. And so this is saying that people are poor not because of the inherent system in which we live, that is capitalism, but because of byproducts of the capitalist system, namely the institutions that thwart people in the way of opportunities. And so this is saying that people are poor perhaps because they don't have the right educational opportunities, that they didn't have the right economic opportunities, or maybe it's in the political system that our political system actually generated poverty. And so looking at the explanation that's surrounding economic changes in our society. So you might say that people are poor because of jobs being relocated to suburbs or to overseas. That creates this mismatch between the skills that people have available and the new jobs that became available, namely in the way of the service sector. And so that might be one explanation for why people are poor, right? Saying that it's these economic changes that have happened over the past 5 decades. More extreme versions might say people are poor because of our political system. We've talked about this explanation before, that suggesting that people are poor because of our welfare system, the structure and generosity of our welfare system, namely incentivizing or creating greater benefits for single-parent families, for example, might have generated and maintained poverty over the years. That's the basic explanation. And so if you think poverty is rooted in the economic structure, certainly you're going to be an advocate for economic change. Or if you think poverty is rooted in the political structure, you're going to want to see a change in our welfare system. And so this is probably the most popular line of explanations here in this third part. And then finally, we have the last major explanation for poverty. This is saying that poverty is rooted in our capitalist system. So this is the Marxist view of poverty, saying that in a capitalist system, generally speaking, you have 2 classes. You have the people who own the means of production, or more formally stated, they're called the bourgeois. And then you have the lower class, or the proletariat in Marxist language. And so the theory here is that, or the idea is that there's a certain segment in our society, namely the bourgeois, or the upper classes, that actually benefit from the existence of poverty. They exploit the lower classes to their advantage. And so if you think about our corporate structure and the major impetus behind corporations, that is profit maximization, that there are people in our society, the basic notion is that there are people in our society, the bourgeois, who actually benefit from the existence of poverty, right? Who benefit from keeping wages as low as possible to maximize their profits. And so if you think poverty is rooted in our capitalist system, then naturally your solution would be to do something about the capitalist structure. We're certainly not going to overthrow the capitalist structure at this point. That's probably not a practical solution, but you may be advocating for workers' rights, for stronger labor unions, for the working class. You may promote the idea that there are 2 classes, right? There's so much inequality that we've practically just generated 2 classes in our society. This is sort of the crux of Marxist type thinking. So in the next part of this lecture, we'll get into measurement of poverty and specifically about how the US Census Bureau goes about measuring poverty today.